We're in Genesis 26, somewhere around there. Genesis 26. All right, well, we've been talking about our patriarchs, if you will, the patriarchs of the Bible. Oftentimes you'll have somebody will say the God of Abraham and of Isaac and of Jacob. And so we're wanting to go back and talk about those. We actually went back farther than that because we talked about Noah. And so just some of these characters that we haven't focused on. We started a long time ago on the life of Moses, and then we did Joshua after that, and we just kind of kept going forward there. But now I want to go back and hit some of these main characters in the Bible. And the one time I did preach on them, I know we went through, this has been years ago, I imagine, but Hebrews 11, and we just talked about those characters as I was going through the different people in Hebrews 11 and that faith chapter. And so we did look at some of these before, and other messages, journey through the Bible. We did, we labored on some of this. They're not new stories. I realize that they're very familiar stories, but we want to look at them, and it is a bit of a study. It's not a whole lot of application that I'm drawing out of it. In fact, tonight, a lot of application that I could draw out of this text would be geared towards fathers, and there's not a whole lot of fathers in here right now. So preaching to you heard about preaching to the choir. Well, what about when the preacher preaches to the preacher? Like, that's kind of a weird weird thing to watch. Okay, so that's not my intention necessarily, but we are going to look at this passage. And anytime we read God's word and we read these stories and these passages, there's application that can be drawn from that would be helpful for us. We do have some young men in here that this could help as they grow up to consider the examples God's provided us in the Bible. Okay, so now we're talking about Isaac, and I think I have mentioned before that there's not a whole lot in here about Isaac. Covers a long span of time, so it's chapter 30-something, 35, I think, where he passes away, and he's mentioned here in verse 20 or chapter 25. Actually before that, because we talked about the first 40 years. First 40 years of his life, not a whole lot's mentioned, but it's at home. It's being obedient to his father Abraham, and we've talked a little bit about that. Not till 40 when he actually gets married. Now, we did talk about how they live a whole lot longer, and so 40, is percentage-wise and ratio of how long he lives was a lot younger, but 40 years is 40 years. It doesn't change depending on no matter how long you live. So they pretty much stayed at home 40 years and then got married. It seems to be somewhat common during that period of time. So we talked about that, the first 40 years of Isaac's life, and then we talked about his the focus being going from Abraham, and now it's shifted onto Isaac. So we follow that, and we're going to get a little bit of application today that would be the same application that we got from that story. Abraham passing on his, all of his, even his wealth, and just kind of like the focus being on his son rather than him. And in this message, we'll talk a little bit about Isaac now passing the focus on to his son. But we talked about him starting his own family, and he was dwelling there in Gerar and digging the wells. That's the last sermon we talked about. And basically, he's finding a place to dwell. He's raising a family. He's gaining wealth and all of that. Look at chapter 26, verse 12. Then Isaac sowed in that land and received in the same year 100-fold, and the Lord blessed him. And the man waxed great and went forward and grew until he became very great, for he had possession of flocks and possession of herds and great stores of servants. And the Philistines envied him, for all the wells which his father's servant had digged in the days of Abraham, his father, the Philistines had stopped them and filled them with earth. We talked about that last week. But this story is after there's a famine in the land, and he doesn't go down into Egypt, but he does lie to some men that are there, very much like Abraham did with Sarah, where he tells them that this is my sister, not my wife. And that kind of gets him into some trouble. But now they're told to dwell in that land. And so he dwells there, and he's working, and he's gaining all this substance. He's getting wealth to the point where it's making people jealous. And they're looking at all that he has, and eventually they're like, you need to get out of here. There's not enough room for your servants and my servants. And so that is kind of where we left off. And now, again, the first 40 years we covered, surprisingly, from 40 years when he marries Rebekah, then here he's dwelling in Gerar, until the time of his death, very little is mentioned in the scripture. And I know it goes all the way till chapter 35 before he dies, but a lot of that is dealing with Jacob and Esau. And so it's kind of interesting. I want to call it the silent years. Okay, so the title of the message is Isaac's Silent Years. And I want to give a basic timeline so that you can kind of see how old he is at certain times of his life and what's going on. The first one, look at chapter 25, verse 20. Chapter 25, verse 20, Isaac marries Rebekah. It says, and Isaac was 40 years old when he took Rebekah to wife, the daughter of Bethuel the Syrian of Padan Aram, the sister of Laban the Syrian. Okay, so 40 years old, and he marries Rebekah. He's off on his own now. He's starting his own family. He's kind of moved on from his father's house, and he marries Rebekah. 40 years old, all right? Now let's look at verse 26. And after that came his brother out. Nope, that's not it. Let's see here. Chapter 25, 26. Yeah, that is it. I'm sorry. And after that, this is his children are being born. We got to back up to verse 24, I guess. And when her days to be delivered were fulfilled, behold, there were twins in her womb. And the first came out red all over like a hairy garment, and they called his name Esau. And after that came out his brother out, and his hand took hold of Esau's heel, and his name was called Jacob. And Isaac was 80 years old when she bare him. Okay, so now he marries Rebekah at age 40. Now he's 60 years old when she bears Jacob and Esau. And I made this mistake, and I remember looking back, I even made this in a message. I forget sometimes that Jacob and Esau were twins. And I think in one of the sermons I was talking about how Jacob was like mama's baby boy, and implying, I don't know what I said exactly, but implying in my mind that he's the youngest, and so she coddled him and everything. They're the same age. Jacob and Esau, like literally he's like holding on to his heel, Esau's heel whenever he comes out. And so like they're not that far apart in age. But it's hard to remember that sometimes because the Bible does talk about the one being the elder and the one being younger. But I forget about that sometimes. But here they are twins when he's age 60. Okay, now we do understand as we read the text and we go further on that he watches his grandchildren born. We don't know exactly when that was, but probably another 40 years, considering like everybody seems to be getting married around 40 in this part of the scripture. So another 40 years, that would put him at 100 years old. He's watching his grandchildren be born, and he's seeing all these things. Chapter 35. Go to chapter 35. Starting in verse 28, and the days of Isaac were 180 years. That's 180. And Isaac gave up the ghost and died, and was gathered to his people, being old and full of days. And his sons, Esau and Jacob, buried him. All right, so he lives 180 years. That's a good long life, right? 180 years. First 40 at home, obeying his parents, learning, growing. After 40, he marries Rebekah. 20 years before she's able to have children, he's praying, Lord, open her womb. They have twins. He watches his grandchildren grow, and then he dies at 180 years old. But really, that's pretty much all we know. Like, we don't see a whole lot of stories and things that happen in his life. There's just little bitty things that we've tried to focus and pull out of the text. But ultimately, this is what we know about him. Some of the things we do know, or we can at least assume from the text, are what I want to look at in this message. But again, I'm calling it the silent years because for the most part, there's just not that much said. The focus, again, kind of like Abraham, the focus turns to Isaac. Now, from Isaac's generation, the focus is going to turn to his sons, primarily Jacob, but Jacob and Esau. And the text talks about them. And that's how life goes. You know, we got to remember that life is about, you know, doing what you can, being successful, and then that passes right on to your children. And if you read the Ecclesiastes, Solomon struggled with this concept. He's like, oh, I do all this work, and I live this long life, and all my labor is in vain because at the end of my life, I just pass it on to somebody else. And in his case, he passed it on to his son, which wasn't all that great of a guy. Okay, but the first thing that I want to talk about that we can assume or gather about about Isaac from this text is that Isaac was a hard worker. Okay, well, most people I think in Bible times were hard workers. This was just the way of life. Now, what we can learn from the Bible is that a work day or a work week looked like this. And I'm sorry, particularly guys, but women should be working just as hard as the men. They just work in a different capacity. But men, you know, it doesn't sound fun. It doesn't sound like something we want to do. But the reality is a work week, typical work week in the Bible days seems to have been 6 days a week, 12 hours a day. And none of us want that. 8 hours a day, 5 days a week is sufficient, for most people. That's what they want. If they get more than that, then they start complaining about how long their week is, okay? But Exodus 20, you don't have to go there, but Exodus 20, remember it says, in 6 days shalt thou do all thy labor. Okay, now, I realize you could make the argument that says it just means to get it done in 6 days. It doesn't have to, it could be 3 days, but it's in that 6 day period. You had 6 days to get all the work done. All right, fair enough. But whatever the case, we see the average person is just working. That's their job. Unless they have a festival to go to, they have the feast days and all this kind of stuff. Unless they had some kind of vacation, something going on, their life was work. In Matthew chapter 20, there's the story Jesus tells about a man or men that go, he picks up these guys that are looking for work. You can do that today, by the way. You go to early in the morning, a guy has a mowing business or pretty much any construction job or something like that. They can go to places like Home Depot. And I don't know, it's probably not legal, but they can go to Home Depot and there's people standing there waiting for work, It's just kind of this understood thing. You go there and you pick them up and then you drive them out to the construction site and let them work. So I've been told. I've never done that or picked anyone up. But there are like manpower, I think it's called, where guys that are needing a job, they just go there and they'll supply them work. There's always work to be done. This is why I don't really feel that bad for someone who's holding a sign, says, "Oh, I'm poor, anything you can give will help." And then they got a nice pair of legs, they can walk around just fine, nice tennis shoes. They're looking like they're pretty healthy. Otherwise, they're just like, "Oh, I fell on some bad luck and I need help." Probably they're just trying to get some money and they're not willing to work, which the Bible actually condemns that. Okay, they can go find work if they want, but they think it's easier just to hold a sign and get people to give them money. All right, you say, well, what if you did it for 6 hours a day, for 6 times a week for 12 hours a day? It's not work, okay? Begging, asking for money is not work unless that's all you can do. There's a case, obviously, for people who need to get assistance because they can't physically do the job. That's not the case here. But let me show you this. Go to Genesis chapter 3. And this comes up a lot when I'm talking to men about working and our responsibilities. This was designed by God from the very beginning. Really, before the fall, man was made to work. He put him in the garden and he gave him a job to do. Amen, Zachary? Working in the garden, that's your job. Okay. But even after the fall, man was made to work. But now it's like God saying, okay, you're going to you're going to fall into sin like this. If you don't have enough work, how about I give you some toil, some labor? You're going to sorrow. You're going to have thorns and thistles, and you're going to have to work by the sweat of your brow. But look at chapter 3, verse 17. This is the curse that was given to man. He says, and unto Adam he said, because thou hast hearkened unto the voice of thy wife, and hast eaten of the tree of which I commanded thee, saying, thou shalt not eat of it. Cursed is the ground for thy sake. In sorrow shalt thou eat of it all the days of thy life. Now, for thy sake, I suppose that could be interpreted like because of what you did, the ground's cursed. But I read it like for thy sake. In other words, this is for your own good that I'm cursing the ground, because working is going to keep you out of trouble. Working hard, providing for your family is going to give you a sense of purpose. It's going to keep you healthy. All these things. And so men today that try to avoid work and they do as little as possible, that's not good for them in many ways. One, too much time on their hands. They're going to get in trouble. They're going to find some kind of trouble to cause. Or they're just going to get lazy, and they're going to have poor health because they're not working the way that they should. Okay? So we need to stay busy. I would say to somebody even that retired, or somebody that they got enough money coming in, maybe they just don't need to work that much or whatever. Man, you better find something to labor, find a hobby, find something that's going to require your effort of building something and sweating, making something work, because God designed us to do that. Not doing that is just going to get us into trouble. So we've got to commit ourselves to work. Children from the time, up until college age, a big portion of their work is their education. They're supposed to be working and learning and growing, being tutored and figuring out how to do these things so that when it's their time, they can work. And I'm going to tell you that's discouraging. All right, most guys, if they stop and think about it, it's not discouraging though. If we just do it by faith and understand that it's good for us, but to just look on it, especially from a youth perspective, a young person's perspective, like, why would I want to waste so much of my life working? I mean, if you factor it all in, like how many days, how much of your life you spend sleeping. Okay, I hate that. This is why I try not to get a whole lot of sleep, because it bothers me. I'm wasting either time that I could be working or time that I could be enjoying something that I like to do. And so some people are like, well, I enjoy sleeping. I just feel like it's a waste of time. Obviously you need it. It's good for you. You can't go without sleep. But if you factor in, if you wrote down on a spreadsheet how many hours you spend doing different things, sleeping is a big portion of your day right off the top. Now, you need to get that sleep so you can rest, and so your body's strengthened, and so you can do your work. So now you take your work day, and how much of that time is spent working, that's going to be another huge part of your day. Then, guys that are married, you're going to have to try to put in some family time, do something with the kids, talk with your wife, keep that relationship going, different things around the house that need to be fixed. That's one that I kind of let go usually, but, unfortunately. But there's so many things to do, and then you're thinking, man, I get older now. Here I am in my 40s, 50s, 60s, and you're just like, man, I spent so much of my life just working. Don't be discouraged by that. That's a good thing. That's what we should be doing. And in this case, how do you think Isaac gets so wealthy and so successful? Because he's working, and God's blessing, and people are seeing his success because he's learning, he's growing. Every time you work and do something, you're learning more about how to do the job or whatever. You're getting better at it, and then that's going to produce more success, more wealth, and all those kinds of things. Okay. So we see from the life of Isaac that he's probably a hard worker. It definitely seems like he's a hard worker. So the second thing, though, that we see as we read the story, again, it kind of switches to Jacob and Esau, and it doesn't say a whole lot about Isaac anymore. But what we know about Jacob and Esau, we kind of start to speculate, like, what's going on? Why is his dad not involved in this? Why is his dad doing these things? Maybe his dad's not such a good dad. And so we learn that even though he's a hard worker, his absence, it seems to be causing problems. He wasn't as successful as a father as he was at the work that he was doing in his hands. And this is a common problem. A lot of guys that are hard workers, they're gone. In fact, I would say kind of an entire generation this happened. You know, guys were going out there, they're working hard, and it was their job. They're the breadwinners, and they're providing for their family, so they're working. And then they're just not at home, you know. And then, of course, you got even worse in our society with those people who just forsake their families and you know, they're not around for their kids and stuff like that. But then you had these guys that were gone working all the time, and they weren't there to invest in their children. They weren't there to help them learn and grow and all that. And then a whole generation kind of got messed up in that way. Well, it still goes on today. You can be such a hard worker, and you're so busy and all this stuff that you don't actually put your time into your family that needs to be there. Very, very difficult balance, but necessary in life to balance these things out. Yes, I got to work all this time, maybe 6 days a week, 12 hours a day. Yes, I've got to make sure that I'm on top of all these other things, and I got to make sure that, you know, and that's what families can kind of help you out, and they can take care of some of those things while you're gone. But ultimately, it's your responsibility as a dad. And again, I know there's no dads in here that I'm preaching to, but okay, but he wasn't so successful as a father, it seems. Now, it doesn't mean he's completely a failure. There's, in fact, I would say overall he's probably a good father, but we can see some signs. Here are some of the signs. I'm not going to go to these verses and break it down, but I think you can just follow along with me. But what is this deal with his wife, Rebecca, not telling him that God said Jacob is the one that's going to be blessed? I still don't understand why all the deception. You know, why did she have to help Jacob to deceive his father? It seems like she should have been able to sit down and have a conversation with Isaac and say, like, here's what God showed me. And maybe she did, but we don't see that in the text. And so I can assume that there was something missing in that relationship, some reason that she didn't share this with him. I don't know. But it seems to have been an issue, like this wasn't discussed. Maybe it was discussed. If it was discussed, he acts as though he didn't care or didn't understand it, because he doesn't give that blessing to Jacob, or he doesn't try to give that blessing to Jacob. We see that it appears that he shows some favoritism. Now, I spent time in another message talking about this, but we can't necessarily, actually I didn't do that here. I forgot. I did that in Kansas City. I was talking about partiality in raising children. Okay, and so I used this text. So there's this passage does say that Isaac loved Esau. He was a hunter. He loved the venison that he brought him. You know, he liked the way that he cooked this venison and all that. And then it says that Rebekah loved Jacob. Now that would seem to indicate that there's some favoritism, that Jacob is favored by his mother, Esau is favored by his father. The text doesn't actually say that. I think it's more of a situational favoritism, in that because of the situation at that time, he favored him. He loved it. You know, he loved that Esau could hunt and cook. And so at that time, whenever he wanted him to bring him some food, he was like, oh, why don't you go do this for me? And he loved him. I feel like it's a little bit more than that, than just like, I just love Esau more than I love Jacob. But anyway, it still seems like there is some kind of favoritism there, which is kind of a sign of a father not putting a lot of work into making sure that he's spending equal attention and showing equal love to his children. Also, it seems like his children aren't getting along very well, are they? Jacob and Esau fighting over the birthright and deceiving each other, or I guess Jacob's deceiving Esau, to the point where Esau wants to kill him. He's so mad and he's so jealous. And so these are obviously bad signs of things not going well in the house. And let me just say that would be the case too for a family that's kind of, something's missing in the family if no one's getting along. I mean, I think everybody in here probably has some story, maybe not your immediate family, or maybe it was, I don't know, you got brothers and sisters that don't get along, but sometimes maybe your family did, but then, the certain children, grandchildren don't get along or whatever the case. And it's somewhere down the road, you're like, well, there's something that happened here, something disconnect in the family. What went wrong? That it's not, they can't get along and they're, at each other's throat. I'm just saying all these signs appear to be some kind of indication that because of all the work, hard work, no doubt, committing himself to this job, committing himself to, digging these wells and accomplishing all this and having the cattle and making sure the servants know what they're doing and all that, perhaps let the ball down a little bit with this family. Look at chapter 26, verse 35 or 34. And Esau was 40 years old when he took to wife Judith, the daughter of Beeri the Hittite, and Beshemath, the daughter of Elon the Hittite, which were a grief of mind unto Isaac and to Rebekah. So again, you got Esau getting married at 40. This seems to be a common age. And so he goes to a part of the family like that kind of is the Philistines. They're the not so good people. They're not following the Lord by any means. And it's a grief in the minds of Isaac and Rebekah that Esau would do this. And so they actually tell Jacob, no, don't do that. Go to this house, go to our household, and among your people who worship God and all this, and you get your wife there. Esau, that wasn't the case. He went after the wrong crowd. And so one of the indications, again, that family has gone wrong, maybe the dad dropped the ball somehow, is that his family is seeking attention from the world, going after the wrong type of people, not putting things in the right priority. It could be because the father dropped the ball and didn't make sure that his house was in order and being run properly. Now, I was just asked today about qualifications of a pastor. And of course, a pastor is supposed to have his house in order. A good example that he's going to be able to lead the church is that he can lead his family and has his children in subjection, all this kind of stuff. And so that is obviously something that a pastor, should be able to do, is keep his house in order. But anyway, the question was, what about a child that leaves the house? After he leaves the house, then he's living a rebellious lifestyle, but not necessarily at home. Would the pastor still be disqualified even though his child did that? Well, in reality, I would say no, because as long as he was enforcing things at home, like he can't control necessarily what his child's going to do when he leaves the house, but you just want to make sure that while he was at home, these rules were being enforced. But then I was also thinking, at the same time, if all his children are going after the world and they're not following the Lord, it's like, where did you drop the ball? Where did you not lead your family to love the Lord and want to do those things, that they would leave the house and their affections just go totally to the world? It would make you wonder, but would it necessarily mean that the pastor's disqualified? Not in my opinion. But in this case, Esau goes after the wrong women. It's a grief to his parents. Now, I will say this. When Esau finds out that it was a grief to his parents, he tries to switch things up and he goes after Ishmael's family, which still isn't right. But anyway, it seems like maybe he's trying to win his parents' favor. Which leads me to my next point. Okay, I do believe that Isaac was a pretty good guy, and even though he had faults and he made some mistakes, had some failures, I believe he's a pretty good guy, and his children did learn from him for sure. I would think that that's obvious in the text, okay? One way or another, they learned from him, and they took what he had taught them into their life, okay? If I had to guess, who do you think it was that taught Esau how to hunt? Probably Jacob. Probably Isaac. Not Jacob. Jacob's his brother. Isaac probably taught him how to hunt, go catch the venison. Who do you think taught him how to cook the venison? I would guess his mother. Why? Because later on, his mother cooks the venison, or cooks a lamb, and tries to make it taste like venison would taste. She could figure out how to do that. So she obviously knows what it is that her husband likes about Esau's cooking. And so I would guess that she probably, while he was growing up at home, taught him how to make this and how to prepare this venison and all that. But, I would guess he probably taught him how to hunt. This is why when it mentions that he loves Esau and it talks about him being a hunter and bringing the venison and all that stuff, I picture in my head, this is something, that's why I said situational favoritism, because at that moment he's just like, oh, how was the hunt today? And he's going on about this and oh, did you do this? And you can see him kind of like in my head, I can see him, discussing how the hunt was and, oh, did you go to this one location? And kind of sharing that because they had this in common. Okay. Now, my advice to parents, like I said in Kansas City, when I was talking about this text, my advice to parents is that they would catch that they're doing that, understand that they're doing that, and try their best to make it an equality so that all the kids know that they love them equally and want to share in their interest and all that stuff. But there are times where in that moment, these two are sharing something in common, and so there's going to be that bond there. Okay, so I would assume that rubbed off, and Isaac did teach his son some things. And don't think Jacob didn't know how to be a man and how to work and do all that. We see that right away, which we're not talking about Jacob right now. I'll do that soon, so I don't have to labor too much on it. But we know that he ends up raising cattle, and he's very successful at it. He's very good at it. We know that he was a strong man, so you don't want to think Esau was this hard, rugged man that went into the woods and he knew how to work. And Jacob was this man that stayed home with mom, and he was always well manicured, didn't get his hands dirty, no calluses, this. I don't believe that was the case. I believe Jacob knew how to work hard as well. And so we see that when he leaves the house, he becomes a man. First thing you see him doing is helping the woman, which he ends up marrying, by moving the stone out of the well so they can go down and they can get water. And so this was a heavy thing. They couldn't do it, so they needed somebody to help them, and he does it himself. I'm thinking I'm not telling that story right. But anyway, we see that he's, again, works with the cattle. He's a good businessman, sort of. He kind of gets tricked a little bit by his father-in-law, but and both Jacob and Esau seem to know how to get around in the world, to socialize with different people in the parts of the world, and to have those connections. These are taught one way or another by the father. Now, kids can learn from their fathers without their fathers holding their hand and teaching them how to do things. And whereas I do think that Isaac probably failed in this area, the children did learn from him, no doubt. Okay, so these are silent years. I'm calling silent years because in the Bible we really don't see that much about what's going on with Isaac and what is he doing with his children and how is he teaching them. We're talking about from age 40, let's say like age 60, all the way up to age, well, when he dies, he's 180. Okay, so all those years, kind of quiet. We don't really see a lot, but we can gather up these things. And in the end, there was no animosity. They loved their father. And, you can kind of see that in the text. Even though they didn't get along and they were mad, Esau was a little mad at his father for giving the blessing, even though it wasn't his fault. There was certain things. But in the end, we do see that they both honor their dad. We see that, which was the custom, but we see that in the burial, just like Isaac and Ishmael buried Abraham. Chapter 35, verse 29. And Isaac gave up the ghost and died and was gathered into his people, being old and full of days. And his sons, Esau and Jacob, buried him. So they put aside their differences. And of course, we know the story, which we'll talk about soon, where Jacob and Esau, they were enemies. Esau was going to kill Jacob, but then they end up patching things up. And here we see them getting together, putting that aside, and honoring their father. So that's what we can gather, what we can pull out of the text, if you will, in regards to the silent years of Isaac. But ultimately, just like Abraham passes things on to Isaac, Isaac is now passing things on to Jacob and Esau, and particularly Jacob, because he's going to be the one that carries on the blessing, like God wanted from the beginning. but Jacob just wasn't privy to that information. All right, let's go to Lord in prayer. Father, thank you for this little study and the life that we have of all of these Bible characters. We thank you for what we can learn from the relationship of Jacob and Esau and their father and mother. And I pray, Lord, that you'll help us to keep that before us as we raise children, grandchildren, and pass these things down. Help me as a father and our young men here that might be fathers one day to keep these in the back of their mind, that we should work hard, but we should also balance that the best we can with putting time into raising our children, our families, and then also, Lord, that our children would just learn to make sure they're honoring and respecting their parents, and that transition as they pass on their the focus to pass on that focus to their children later on in life, that you would also help us to do that with our children. In Jesus' name I pray, amen.